Hi everyone, welcome back. I'd now like to introduce our international keynote speaker, Vince Warren, who is a leading expert on racial injustice and discriminatory policing and is the Executive Director of the US-based Center for Constitutional Rights. Vince oversees the organization's groundbreaking litigation and advocacy work. Under his leadership, the Center for Constitutional Rights successfully challenged the NYPD's Stop and Frisk policy and profiling of Muslims, ended long-term solitary confinement in California's Pelican Bay prison, and established the persecution of LGBTQIA people as a crime against humanity. The Center for Constitutional Rights is currently challenging the abuse of migrants at the US southern border, the Muslim ban, the torture of prisoners in Abu Ghraib, and the criminalization of transgender people, as well as providing legal and policy support to Black, Brown, and Native organisers across the country. Vince will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be the opportunity for Q&A from the audience for the last 20 minutes. Please post your questions in the Q&A function, which we'll be monitoring, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And without further ado, thanks so much for joining us, Vince.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah, and it's wonderful to be here virtually with you all. I really wish I was in Australia right now. I'm speaking to you from Lenape land, also known as New York in the United States, and I'm honored to have been asked, and I'm very excited to talk with you all. So big props go to Tila and Susie and Sarah and Brooke and Zoe for putting together this amazing first-of-a-kind one-of-a-kind conference that y'all are going to be talking about for the rest of your careers. I'm telling you, because I know the Slack channels are popping, everybody's introducing each other. This is what this is about. It's about bringing community together, and that's the way that we make change as people. So yeah, I'm really super excited to talk with you all. A couple of things you need to know about me. One is I am a Black lawyer that's been practicing in the United States now for about 30 years. I got politicized in college, actually before law school, around the South African divestment issues. And I always knew that I wanted to be a lawyer. I very much wanted to be a lawyer for some reason, I don't know. Both of my parents were public school teachers. I'm also a musician, but for some reason I'm like, this law thing is kind of intriguing. Side note, I wanted to be a lawyer so badly that in university and college, my first semester, I took Latin, the language Latin, the dead language Latin. Why did I take that? Because stupid me thought, well, I think, there's a lot of the law that happens in Latin. I actually failed that class my first semester, but it didn't deter me from being a lawyer. It just deterred me to do a little bit better in Latin, all of which I've forgotten at this point. So let's just be thankful that I'm not doing that again. But I did become a lawyer because as a Black man in America, I knew that we were not getting a fair deal, and I knew that the key to being able to change some of those things meant being able to decrypt, decode, understand the law that sort of held us in place. And I didn't realize at the time, how deeply structural that problem is. But I want to tell you a little story about how I got started, and I think a lesson that I've carried with me to this point, which I hope that you will find useful as you're thinking about what you're going to do in Australia. I want to talk about a man named Haywood Burns, and Haywood Burns was a legend in the social justice civil rights field in the United States. He was someone that I looked up to and admired, and I wanted to be like. He actually got his start not first as a lawyer, but as an organizer. As a teenager, he successfully desegregated a swimming pool in Peekskill, New York, which is not too far from where I am right now. It was his hometown. He then participated in Freedom Summer, which was in the 1960s. 1964, he went down to the South to organize Black folks around a range of issues that they were fighting in terms of their repression. In 1969, he helped found the National Conference of Black Lawyers, which is an organization that would come to mean a lot to me in my career. It is the radical Black legal organization in the United States. And he also ran the Harvard University Board of Overseers, Harvard University in the US, on a divestment of South Africa platform. And like me, he was a trustee of the Center for Constitutional Rights, which I now run. But when I met Haywood in 1980, it was a cloudy day at City University of New York Law School. I was asking for advice. I was thinking about the law. I was thinking about applying to law school. I didn't know if I could do the kind of work that I really wanted to do. I didn't know if it was possible to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. And he told me with this broad smile that he had these wonderful shining eyes, and he said, listen, in this line of work, the only thing that will limit you would be your discomfort with demanding from power what needs to be demanded and saying to power what needs to be said. And at the time, I was like, okay, great, but should I apply to this law school or should I apply to that law school? And it really wasn't until years into my career and working with social movements that I began to realize how important that was. Really two parts of it. Everybody, all of y'all, are into the speaking truth to power thing, right? The state, the government, this corporation, the local council, they're doing horrible things to people, and somebody's got to stand up and say something. And so many of us in this work see ourselves as the people that do that, and hatfully so. The other part of what he told me really resonated with me. So it's not just that you're expected to speak truth to power, but you also have to understand that the limitations of your doing that has to do with your own discomfort. And I want to dig into that for a little bit, because look, I don't have to tell y'all, the law is a really conservative profession. Why, oh why, oh why do people that believe in freedom ever decide to go to law school and get stuck up in this system that really spends more time thinking about diction and grammar than it does about justice sometimes? Why do we do this? And look, the reason why I'm in this work and the reason why I want to do this work is because the law is one of those structural mechanisms without which people could more easily be free. So weirdly enough, many of us went to the law to do good things, to use the law in favor of clients, in favor of people, in favor of positions. And it's important to recognize that the law could be a tool of liberation in the right hands, but it also has been, and will continue to be a tool of repression in the hands of the people that it is currently in. And that's a very important piece for us to remember, that the law in itself doesn't save lives. It doesn't change hearts and minds. Every social justice advancement that we've had in the world, particularly from the people that are the most impacted, has not stemmed from the mouths of lawyers. They've stemmed from the hearts, and they've stemmed from the beliefs and the conviction of the communities that know the repression the best. And what the communities very often, although not always, need is they need allies, they need friends, they need support. And that's where we come in. So getting back to that question of discomfort, one of the questions that you should be asking yourselves is, look, am I an insider or am I an outsider? Let me talk a little bit about that. What do I mean by that? An insider are people that, and this has nothing to do with where you work, but it has to do with how you see yourselves in the framework of the profession. So if you're an insider in the profession, you talk a certain way, that you write a certain way, you comport yourself a certain way. We're trained to do that. It's a very formal process. But the insiders tend to make excuses for why justice can't happen, period. Why justice can't happen on the timeline that we think it should happen. And they also will look at the conduct and the culpability and sometimes the criminality of the people that are seeking justice as a reason not to give it. And one of the pieces that's important for us as lawyers is that if we adopt the mentality that justice only comes to those that deserve it within the confines of what has been written a couple of hundred years ago, interpreted by a whole lot of very privileged white men, if that's the only remedy, if that's the only framework within which justice can happen, we might as well just give up. We might as well not be lawyers, because we're doing the thing that Sarah framed for us. We are reinforcing reifying the structure that oppresses us. Let's think about the outsider for a second. And, you know, I'm not going to lie to y'all. Outsiders are some of my favorite people. The outsider thinks about community first and law second. That the outsider, particularly those of us that are connected to communities, that come from communities, that communities rely on to be able to articulate what the community is feeling in the legal framework, outsiders are much more concerned with raising the issues that need to be addressed and creating solutions to those problems than they are about what the law actually says. Because look, if you look at it this way, when slavery existed in the United States, this was not a moral question only as people framed it. It was not a religious question as people tried to justify it. It was a legal question. That slavery in the United States was as legal as anything else. And the only way that that stays legal is when lawyers, who are the insiders in particular, say, look, there are good reasons for this. And even if I don't like it, that's what the law says. And it's up to another branch of government or something or someone else to change it. Insiders tend to reify the structural problem. Outsiders, now faced with, well, there's no precedent in the United States for legal precedent for not having slavery. So where on earth are we going to find the legal arguments that are going to bring the system down? You can't do it on your own, but what you do is you connect with the folks who are the most deeply affected. These are the enslaved people themselves. And you talk with them about their stories and their narratives and what they want, and they become the spokespeople for what change looks like. And that in essence is what movement lawyering is about. So, you know, a couple of rules. If you find that you're arguing your case and you're in the bench or the dock or whatever they call it, and you're looking behind you and there's nothing but lawyers, there's nobody from the community, there are no folks that are impacted, that is putting the legal framework above the community ask. When you are in court, and I don't know whether this is standard in Australia, I suspect it's not, because it's not standard in the United States either. When you're in court, the goal is to be able to have your clients, the people that you are representing, tell their own stories to be able to change the hearts, the thinking, the perspective of the decision makers in order for them to say, well, even though this law requires this thing, I'm looking into your heart and I'm hearing your soul, and it does not feel right to me, so we're going to do something else. That is a powerful, powerful tool, and it doesn't happen all the time. But when it does happen, it is miraculous. And so thinking about yourself as a lawyer as hero, it's not going to work. You may be a hero to some people in the community that said, my God, the way that you got up and talked to that judge and you laid these, it's exactly what we were thinking. And they might think of you as a hero, but one shouldn't think of oneself as a hero, because what ends up happening is that we tend to think more about what we think and what we want than what the community wants. And that is not a recipe for social justice. That's a recipe for being an insider. So being uncomfortable with the demands that the community is making on power is your job. But your job is to live in that discomfort, deal with that discomfort, and despite that discomfort, stand with the people against the power. Even if you think that your colleagues on the bench will think that you are a bad lawyer, or they might think that you're saying things that just don't make sense, or you're asking for the impossible, or you're not being reasonable. Despite all of that, your job, our job, is to stand with the people that don't have the privilege that we have to be able to address the court in those ways. That's really critically important. And I want to focus on the question of discomfort, because look, we can tell stories all day, hero stories. Let me tell you about hero stories. You all have heard the hero stories. You know, Thurgood Marshall in the United States was a hero, and Constance Baker Motley was a hero. All these extraordinary lawyers that worked for the NAACP, the civil rights advocates are heroes. You know, Riverbank Frank, hero. But when you tell that story backwards, meaning like telling it the story from this point and talking about what it was like back then, you know, there was never a day that wasn't sunny. No one had menstrual cramps. No one was hungover. Everything fell into place beautifully because you're telling that story backwards. But when you tell the story forwards from this point in our time and tell that story forward, there's nothing but anxiety. There's fear. There's concern. There's danger. And that's the importance of storytelling, because when your clients are able to articulate in this moment what is happening to them right now, it is compelling beyond words. You can't turn a blind eye to it. A court may not agree with it, a court may not consider it, but being able to tell that story in the moment is really, really key. And I think when you start telling your stories as lawyers, not only to the court, but to each other, of where you are, where you came from, try telling that story forward. Talk to people about what you're afraid of. Talk to people about what you're concerned about. It might come up as, I'm concerned that I won't be taken seriously as a lawyer if I take that position. The time to do that is with your colleagues so that the community can rely on you when that moment comes, that you're like, let's go, let's go. I know that I'm going to get in trouble. I know that people might think less of me, but what these people need me to say is the most important thing. So leaning into that discomfort is really, really important. I'm lucky to be the head of a great organization called the Center for Constitutional Rights. Many of you might not have heard of us, but some of you will have heard some of the work that we've done. We are a US-based human rights organization that litigates and uses advocacy and storytelling in our work. We litigate locally as being here in New York. We litigate nationally throughout the United States, and we litigate internationally using often regional court bodies. And the breadth of work that we've been able to do, I think, honestly, even as having been there for 15 years, is pretty stunning to me. We've tackled massive issues like the Stop and Frisk program, the police stopping and frisking Black and Latinx men and women and people, in New York City. We successfully did that. We successfully challenged long-term solitary confinement in Pelican Bay Prison, which had the most people in solitary confinement of any prison in the United States. We've challenged race-based police killings, illegal detentions at Guantanamo Bay Prison, the persecution of LGBTQI people, illegal drone strikes, Muslim bans, asylum bans, and all sorts of indignities that folks have been dishing out. I can dig into a little bit of those things, but it's not the what that's important, it's the why. And the reason we do this work, the reason we are able to do this work, is if you look at that big long list of things, to people in the social justice field, those feel like obvious things to tackle. In fact, many people would have critiques. Well, how come you're not doing this? And how come you're not doing that? But if you look at mainstream society, whether we're talking about Australian society, US society, or any other society, these are the most radical, complex issues of the day. Should the United States be using drone strikes in countries with which it's not at war? Should the United States be putting men in detention in Guantanamo without any trial indefinitely because of a so-called war on terror? Should US-based evangelicals be able to go to Uganda and preach that gay Ugandans should be jailed and killed and not be held accountable for it? These are enormous issues, but the reason why we can do them is because we spend a lot of time thinking about what our political alignment is, and we think a little bit about discomfort, and we think about what would it take for us to be able to articulate what needs to be articulated, even though the entire world thinks it's bananas. There are two types of cases that we do at the Center for Constitutional Rights, both of which are important, which I will talk about. One of the types of cases that fall into the category of Guantanamo and drone strikes, and when we represented people who were being tortured after 9/11, being sent to other countries to be tortured, or the proposed elimination of asylum at the US border. These are cases that we call fight power cases. And fight power cases are cases where the state, I'll call it the state, has done the bad thing or is about to do the bad thing. And it's going to have a broad application. Men in Guantanamo, drone strikes, essentially closing the southern border, Muslim bans. And in those cases, social justice movements are not always prepared to respond at the level at which the threat comes. So for example, in the United States for many years, there has been a dwindling anti-war movement. Dwindling is a kind word, because I know that this is going to be made public and I don't want to offend anybody, but it's not what it used to be. And so when one of the most popular presidents on the planet, Barack Obama, decided in 2010 that he was going to use drones to take out US citizens in Yemen, it was very hard to get a social movement going around that issue that would be able to issue some sort of demands. And those are the types of things, if they're going to kill somebody on Thursday, you got to file the lawsuit on Tuesday and get it stopped. So these are cases in which we move very quickly to be able to get, to put sand in the gears, to be able to slow down the killing machine, to be able to make a case before things move forward or as they move forward, why they shouldn't happen. And those cases are high profile, but they are also very, very, very hard to do. Technically, they're super, super hard. And that you have to have the framework that if you take on that case, it will make things better for everybody. That's one part of the cases that we do. Another part of the cases that we do, which is really where movement lawyering comes in, are the build power cases. The first of fight power, these are build power. Build power cases are one where typically we will be in community or a social movement group will come to us and ask a question. Hey, is there anything we can do about US actors that are coming to Uganda and essentially instructing our legislature on how to create death penalty statutes for LGBTQI people? Hey, there is a huge plastics plant that is about to be built on our ancestral burial grounds in southern Louisiana. Isn't there anything we can do about that? These are movement cases. And by movement, there are some that are broad formal movements or plentiful movements like Black Lives Matter, where there are identified issues, leads, and goals that we can follow along with and we get brought in to support those goals. They can be community-based, where it's not, these aren't necessarily political people, but they've been politicized by what's been done to them. Their land has been stolen. Women are being raped and disappearing and nobody's doing anything about it. The water is being poisoned. The cops are coming in and beating everybody up. These are communities that are politicized by what's being done to them. And they're like, hell with that, no more. And they say, we've heard that you guys work with communities. Is there anything we can do about that? Those are some of our favorite cases. And that's the piece that I'd love to be able to talk with you more about how that happens. Because when you do those cases, you're actually at the service of, quite literally at the service of communities. And these are communities that very often no one has ever listened to them before. No one has really given a crap about what they've been complaining about. In fact, most of the surrounding communities could benefit from what's happening. So for example, the plastic plant that's coming into St. James, Louisiana, the Black folks in St. James who were born from enslaved people on those lands and fought like hell to be able to own those lands and now own them. And the company is buying everybody up and they're basically going to poison the air for everybody else. And the challenge is when you go to the community meetings and you talk about it, a third of the communities like, this isn't right. 2/3 of the communities like, well, that's kind of jacked up, but at least we're going to get some jobs down here. So there are community battles that happen all the time, which complicates the lawyer relationship. It doesn't necessarily complicate the lawyering, but that means that when a community has to work something out and you are lucky enough, privileged enough to be able to be called in to sit with them about this issue, there is a rule that I want to lay out now that I hope that you remember. And that is the following thing. When you go into one of those meetings and you're sitting around and there's usually great food and great conversation and the elders talk first and they're having a debate, you say nothing. Nothing. You get paid and you have been trained to open your mouth and to unleash brilliant articulations of what the problem is, what the solutions might be, but you say nothing. And the reason why you say nothing is because, and I can only speak from the context of the US, I want to assume this is true in Australia, is that there is something weird and magical about lawyers, and lawyers walk into the room and everybody wants to know what they think about stuff. This probably happens to you. You go to you used to go to cocktail parties before the lockdown, and you go in and somebody says, oh, all right, you're a lawyer. What do you think about this thing? And you're like, look, bro, I'm just trying to get my drink on. I don't know. But that happens in community as well. You will get asked the question, well, what do you think we should do? That is, you should experience that as a gift that you're going to return. And I mean a return gift, not that you're going to exchange it for something better. When someone says, what do you think? One of the things that you can articulate is, I really think that I would love to know what you all would like to have done. And once you tell me what you'd like to have done, I can suggest some ways that we might do that through the law, but you're going to decide what it is. And when you're able to do that, the power dynamic shifts palpably. It's like your relationship, and if you continue to do that, your relationship will be cemented in that community, because that community runs at the speed of trust. Everybody knows everybody in that community. Don't nobody know you except for one person that brought you in that heard you were kind of a good person. And if you open up your mouth, it's going to change the dynamic. But embedding yourself, being not passive, but listening, being a part of the environment of the discussion rather than being the discussion itself is absolutely critical. That's the essence of movement lawyer, because like I was saying, all of this work moves at the speed of trust. And there are a number of really interesting examples of how that's happened, how that can be good, both domestically and internationally. I wanted to tell an international example, if I could. It's a story that's told by Jackie Dugard, who is the former executive director of SERI, the Social and Economic Rights Initiative in South Africa. And SERI is like a sister organization of CCR, not formally, but we both vibe the exact same way on two different continents. And they do social and economic rights work in SERI in South Africa. We would do that in the United States, except we don't really have social and economic rights, which is another keynote speech and a whole round of beer, which I'm really pissed off about. But that's what they do. And they were talking with community elders about a land issue that they had. And they'd come to SERI, they invited Jackie to the meetings. One of Jackie's first cases, what do you think we should do? Here's what we want to happen. Jackie goes and she researches it. And she's like, it's never going to work. It's never going to work. They say, try it anyway. She tries it anyway. They make a big argument in front of the case. A couple of weeks go by, Jackie gets the decision, and the decision does not go their way. They lose. And one of the issues was being able to sort of identify kind of a key technical problem in the law that allowed landowners to treat people badly. But she lost the case, and she told me she was in tears about it, just in tears. And she was sad that she lost, but it was even worse because she had to go back to the community and say, I failed you. I failed you. And so she goes back to the community. She's holding back the tears, quivering lips, the whole thing. She goes back to the community and she's like, I'm so sorry, but I got the decision and we lost. And one of the elders says to her, that's all right. We're going to win this issue anyway. Jackie says, well, how are you going to win the issue? Because there's actually no path now. This is why I kind of didn't want to do the case, because we created this bad precedent. And the elder said, we'll be fine. But thank you very much. Jackie comes to find out 2 years later, staying in touch with that community, that the community won the exact same issue through organizing, advocacy, and storytelling that they lost 2 years previously on a legal grounds. And when Jackie tells this story, she said, that's when it really cemented for me that the power in the relationship between community and lawyer is actually not in the lawyer. The power in the relationship is in the community, because when a community organizes the way that that community organized, they can use a legal loss as momentum. They can use it as a way to move forward. Actually, organizers could use legal cases to be able to bring people to the issue that hadn't heard about it, because lawsuits can tend to get on television and to get media. But that's, I love that story because that really encapsulates our privilege and our power vis-a-vis the communities that we work with and that we serve, which is that if the situation had been reversed and everybody had put all of their marbles in the legal strategy, not only would they have lost the case, which they did, but they would have lost the momentum for change. People would be like, well, the law says no, what the hell are we gonna do? So I don't know. But what the community did was they were using law as one of a series of strategies that they could employ to be able to make the changes that they need. And it turned out that the law actually helped them. That case brought the attention to the issues. They were able to move it forward in 2 years, by the way, which would have been a much faster timeline than had Jackie won, and the implementation process would have taken 5 or 6 years. So it's important for us to remember, and sometimes it's hard for us to conceive of what it would be like to be quiet and silent and in service of communities, but that's really, really essential in this work. You can get much farther for people when people are leading. You can get farther on issues if you are leading. So for example, all of those fight power cases that we had clients, but we were litigating those cases in court around issues. And we were fairly successful, although Guantanamo is still not closed yet. 20 years later, there are 49 men left out of 779. But though, when you want to litigate issues, go litigate issues. If you want people to win, you have to invest in people legally. That's the piece of it. I mentioned earlier that I'm on Lenape land here in New York, and we had a very interesting case where one of the Lenape elders came to us through a trusted friend. That's the other piece. Trust is everything. So I don't know if it's like dating or not, because it's been a long time since I'm dating, but the idea is that your reputation, let me actually just retract that. Your reputation as a lawyer is probably more important than your ability, your technical ability as a lawyer in movement circles, because people will only want you if someone that they trust vouches for you. She's great, she listens, he's really terrific, they are right on point. So that building that trust is the most important thing, which means that you show up often, you do exactly what you say that you're going to do, you stay in touch, you listen. Well, we heard the Lenape Nation, Ramapo Lenape Nation heard about us. We actually litigated Wounded Knee cases on behalf of the Lakota Sioux in 1972. We represented Native activists at Standing Rock. And they said, we have this problem. The problem is that the town of Mahwah, New Jersey, which is also, by the way, a Native American name, is telling us on our tiny little area that we own that we cannot do any of our dances and celebrations and prayers, because when we burn the wood burns onto the golf course and there's smoke everywhere, and they've got the whole city trying to shut us down to say that we can't do this. And they were doing these types of services in spiritual support of Standing Rock. And so we litigated the case with them, and we ultimately won. But the funny, interesting part of the story is, for those of you that do client-based work, that the client interview is the most important thing. And our legal director, Bahar Azmi, was in the office with one of the tribal elders and was trying to get factually down the timeline for when this situation happened. And he said, so tell me, Chief, how long has this nation been having problems like this? And the chief looked at him and said, about 500 years. And, you know, in the context of what the lawyer was trying to get, which was, well, it started in June, it ended, you know, it was pretty powerful that our client and now our friend and comrade had the clarity to be able to lift this issue of the golf course in Mahwah, New Jersey, back into why this thing has happened. It has always happened in this country ever since there have been white people here. And so he, even as a person existing today, is able to tap into the long history of repression, killing, degradation, and humiliation, and to say this is a manifestation of that. This is not just a nuisance case that gets resolved in the courts. This is a continuing problem. So what did we do as movement lawyers and as radical lawyers? We created a 500-year timeline, because that's what you do. That kind of connection with community, particularly the elders that have learned from other elders that had passed on the stories, not only that people forget, but that have been erased and that we never knew about. Those come alive again in these kind of discussions. I want to close the talk by talking about international solidarity. I think the rules and the things that I'm laying forth, or at least my experiences that you will interpret and that you will make your own or you will reject, are applicable in Australia, and they're applicable in international contexts. Solidarity, not just with your local community, not just with people in the different countries that you all come from, and not just in the context of the lawyer community. Solidarity internationally is key. It is absolutely critical. And it's critical for lawyers, but it is more critical for community groups. Two examples. There was several years ago, there was a First Nations conference in Australia, actually. And a number of colleagues and comrades from the US went to that, and they came back and they said, I had no idea. And I said, you had no idea what? You just met with, you know, all of these wonderful First Nations folks. What did you learn? And they said, I had no idea, number one, that their situation is as bad as it is. And two, that their situation is as bad as ours is. And that solidarity, bringing together, particularly First Nations people around that question, is a spark that has not gone out in the United States. People who went to that conference still talk about it. They still tell stories from other First Nations, origin stories, stories of repression, stories of liberation and freedom in their own communities, because it's inspirational. Those connections are really important. And my goodness, as lawyers, what would it look like if we were able to be invited in to some of those spaces to listen, to learn? And that's not to take them over. I'm not running to a First Nations conference unless I'm invited. But that's the key, being able to have people connected to each other so that they have a better beat on their own, number one, their own subjugation, and number two, a multitude of strategies that have been employed, brilliant strategies by folks, similar folks around the world, to be able to combat these things. And it's the same thing that's happening in this conference. You all are coming together. You're going to hear from extraordinary speakers, some of which, this is going to sound like a name drop because y'all don't know me, but some of which are my close friends, because A, they are my close friends, and B, I love them dearly and I learn from them all the time. So you are in for a tremendous treat. But that's what this conference is really about, isn't it? it's about sharing those stories and sharing those perspectives and learning from each other, learning from those of us that come from Black, Brown, First Nations communities, how we're wrestling with the law, how we're wrestling with our communities wrestling with the law, how you can help support us, how we can help support you and be comrades and allies together. That's why I'm very excited, honestly, to be speaking at this conference. You all are at the very beginning, the very tip beginning, all 600-700 of you, at the very tip beginning of a journey that's going to last for the rest of your life, and it is going to change the face of Australia. Because of your work, people in the place that you live will have more access to power. Their voices will be heard. They will be supported. Issues will not be dropped. And most importantly, that you will not feel discomfort. You will not feel discomfort for getting up and saying what needs to be said in a way that it needs to be said. I want to thank you all for letting me talk at you for a little bit. I really wish that I was there with you all, but I would love if people maybe have some questions or some thoughts, or you want to throw stuff at the screen. That's cool too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince, for that incredibly inspiring keynote. I feel like I'm still taking it all in. We'll now open up for our Q&A. Please type your questions into the chat. I'll start off with a question from Sandra, who said, Vince, I'd be interested in hearing more about getting funding and how you think about getting funding to be able to operate on in such a quick and responsive manner.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the question, Sandra. Okay, that's a thing. I'm gonna give you the real answer. And the problem is that it's gonna be a US answer. I really can't speak to Australia. Three things. Number one, as political lawyers, we take no government money because we really spend most of our time suing them. Thing number two, we don't take corporate money because we spend our time suing them too, which leaves that we get funding from two sources. One are foundations and the other ones are individuals. Foundations can be really, really slow there are people that like to fight and there are people that like to win. We like to fight. Let's just go do this thing. They like to win. So they're like, you have to prove that the fight that you want to have has been won 15 times before they're going to give you the money. And if it's been won 15 times before, why am I filing this case, right? So they're super slow. So what we do is we rely on individual donors. We've in our organization, we've created an emergency litigation fund, and that's where we put some money aside for cases that need to move really, really quickly, so that we don't have to sit around and ask people for money to do it and get a lot of no's because they just, because this stuff is too radical for them. Once we're in it, then people are like, that's great. So yeah, we'll give you some money. But that's what we essentially do, is we try to keep some money aside to do it. Oh, thing number two that we do, which also might be a US phenomenon, and for those of you who are, I think the 18% or 22% of you that are that are lawyers but are not working in community, this is something that you guys can do. We use law firms. We use big law firms a lot, and they defray a lot of the costs of litigation. And so there are ways for people that go into private law to be able to really help with the litigation, not by paying us to do it, but they have abilities to absorb costs that sometimes nonprofits cannot, and they have expertise on things like discovery and document management that nonprofits do not. So partnering with them really helps.
Thanks, Vince. And the next question is coming in from Sophie Trevitt, who said, I'd love to hear more about how you think about navigating perceived conflicts between acting in your client's best interest and acting in pursuit of community goals. Is it just a matter of true client consent to pursue movement lawyering? Is it a matter of letting go of the idea that lawyers can decide that it is in our client's best interest?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I haven't talked a lot about politics. So let me talk about politics and political alignment because that's very important here. So if you have an individual client that comes from a community, you are representing that individual client. And that's what the canon of law requires. Politically, the way we practice it is that we work with the community and the community helps us develop the clients that would represent the community so that the interests of the clients are the same as the interests of the community. So you're not pitting them against each other. So that's largely in how you pick up clients. We have had situations, for example, where we've represented people in one context where we're making arguments that are problematic in another context, two separate cases. Navigating those takes a lot of internal discussion and with the lawyers as well as with the clients, because you don't want the clients to give up any rights, but you also don't want to win on one issue that then totally eviscerates other communities and other clients' ability to get what they need.
Thanks, Vince. The next question is coming in from Anthony Levin, who asks, apart from public interest litigation, what strategies have you used to address racialized policing and seemingly ossified police culture?
Yeah. So, if you have a lawyer, a storyteller, and an activist, you can change the world. And one of the kind of cool things about my job is I get to be a lawyer when I want to, I get to be an activist when I want to, and I get to be a storyteller when I want to. So what I've been doing largely I've been speaking and doing, I think, talks and particularly a lot of media framing around the questions of police killing, in addition to the litigation that the organization has done. And being of a certain age and with a certain amount of experience and having seen it all and having done this work for 30 years, I can talk about I can talk from personal experience, from when I first had my negative police interaction when I was 14 up until now about what that looks like and how it is. And I think effectively make the argument that this isn't actually, now that we've made the turn and we're not trying to criminalize Black people anymore, and we're talking about reforming the police department, we need to stop talking about reforming the police department. We need to talk about abolishing the police department. Because if you go back beyond when I was 14 to when we were first brought here in 1619 in change, it has been essentially the same playbook. And how effective is it? Are they going to abolish police, by the time you guys get lunch? Probably not. But I do think it's an effective way to speak about the politics and about the history outside of the context of the litigation, which can be a bit stultifying if you do it too conservative.
Vince, can I ask, the next question is from Zulfa S, who says, could you tell us about a time that you felt the most discomfort in your work and how you worked through it?
Yeah, thank you, Zulfa. I can't tell that story. Because that case is still going on. One of the places that I felt very uncomfortable was when I had to. Oh, I noticed. Part of our job is to give a different version of what the state narrative is about what's happening. Right. This is our community's perspective, our clients' perspectives. And sometimes when you do that, you have to call the state and the people that work for the state and even the lawyers that work for the state something along the lines of liars or being disingenuous or playing hide the ball or not telling the whole truth or all that kind of thing. Because at least in the US culture, there's an idea that lawyers is, and I'm going to use this phrase intentionally, is a gentleman's club, and that whatever problems that we have on the outside, we can certainly treat each other within the hallowed halls of the justice system civilly. And that framework, that culture actually allows people to make specious, disingenuous, horrible arguments that they know are not true, but their clients are telling them. The state, you know, under the Trump administration, this happened all the time. So I get personally uncomfortable when calling people disingenuous or calling them out for pushing a line that, even though I don't know it, because you never really know what's in people's hearts, I mean, you just know. I'm like, man, how can you get up and say that? Because you know that's not true. You know that's not what happened, even if that's what the government's position is. And, you know, how dare you? Because people are dying. So my level of discomfort is usually around that personal confrontation in the context of a public forum. John Yoo, who was the master of the guy who wrote the torture memos under the Bush administration, I was on a debate panel with him, and, you know, I had to call that brother out about the torture memos, even though that was not the culture of the panel. And I did it. It did not make me feel comfortable doing it. I'm glad that I did it. There was also General Ricardo Sanchez. I was on a panel with him and Rachel Maddow, and Ricardo Sanchez was someone that was really key in the Abu Ghraib atrocities that were happening. And the story he was telling was like, yeah, it wasn't me, it was somebody else. And here's what we were trying to do. He was trying to rehabilitate himself on stage with me. And I'm like, no, that's not happening. So I did it, but does not make me feel comfortable. It's not my most comfortable moment.
Vince, I'm going to do a mashup of a couple of different questions because I think they're all getting to a similar point. How do you view the lawyer-client relationship and accountability when you're working on the types of cases you described, the fighting power cases, where potentially the group of people you're advocating for are diverse and not yet well connected or organized? For example, when you're working with asylum seekers or, as you said, people impacted by drone strikes.
I'll give you two examples of that. One example is actually Guantanamo. So when we represent the Guantanamo detainees, that's a whole nother, I think we're now on our second round of beer after this, so I can't talk about it now, but that's a whole nother thing about how the communication between lawyer and client happens in the Guantanamo context. But these were men who largely didn't know each other, who were brought to this place and all treated the exact same way. They are held incommunicado from themselves. They were held incommunicado from the world for a while. So we had to represent them en masse until we were able to represent them individually. And then once we represented them individually, there are all of these really interesting ethical issues that pop up, because the government says person X did this with person Y. And so you can't have a conversation with person Y if you're representing person X because there might be an ethical conflict in doing that. So in that litigation, we largely would litigate each issue separately, but we created a group, we recruited 600 lawyers in the United States, the largest pro bono legal pulling together in American history to represent the Guantanamo detainees. And we created what was called the Gitmo Bar Association. And what would happen there is that people, while not discussing individual facts and circumstances, actually talked a lot about what's the strategy to bring down the Bush administration's policy, which included sharing litigation techniques. If you've seen this over here before, they're going to try that. So we actually use that kind of strategy without divulging individual things. So to sum that up, we took the individual cases, but we connected as a group of people to strategize, as a group of lawyers to strategize. The opposite example is when we represented the men in solitary confinement in Pelican Bay Prison. Pelican Bay Prison, the men who were in solitary confinement for 22 hours a day, not seeing another living soul, actually organized a general strike in the prison. And not only did they organize a general strike in the prison, they brokered a deal with a peace deal with all of the gangs in the prison while in solitary confinement through the air ducts. I swear to you, through the air ducts. So one, there was going to be a truce, so there was going to be no violence. And two, they agreed that they were going to file a pro bono on their own case challenging solitary confinement. Through intermediaries, they reached out to us. they asked us to take over the pro bono case, which we did, and then we represented them as named plaintiffs. Now, the difference there is that they were so well organized. And I just want to say this again. These men did not lay eyes on each other, thousands of them. They organized through word of mouth, through the prison ducts, but they were so well organized that they would have meetings and they would essentially say, this is the position that we want to take. This is the position that we don't want to take. It was an extraordinary situation that you never find in prison cases. And that's why it was ultimately successful. So two different examples, one in which the lawyers organized themselves and the other one where the clients organized the lawyers.
Incredible. The final question is also going to be a mashup, and a few people have asked this. Vince, how do you stay grounded when it comes to your mental health, and what do you do to take care of yourself and make time for yourself, given this type of work that you do?
Yeah, it's going to be a mashup of an answer too, in 4 minutes, Sarah. Well, thing number one is I'm a musician. And, you know, I actually used to, when I first started at CCR, I used to play 2 gigs a week. I'm a drummer and do some other stuff. And that really, I mean, it kept me more than grounded. It was also a wonderful experience that created humility, because, you know, of the people that get treated like crap around the world, it's the musicians playing gigs. You know, I have to go with service elevators, and I'm like, yeah, you know, I'm the big time head of CCR, but I'm in the service elevator. I'm like, I'm cool with that because I'm just the drummer today. So tapping into that thing that brings me joy, which is music, has been key. I also this year took a sabbatical. I'm actually still on in my 3rd month of, in the last 2 weeks of my sabbatical. And I'm really happy this is only one of 3 things that I've done work-wise or work-connected since I've been on sabbatical. But I have been totally chilling. I've been writing music, and I've been reflecting on my role and my work. And I'll be honest with you, this is a lot to drop at the end, but the George Floyd killing, and Breonna Taylor's killing and Ahmaud Arbery's killing back in 2020, those were 3 Black people too many for me. I couldn't get out of bed. You know, you have to write these statements about condemning police killing Black people. You have to get up, you have to write that statement. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't do another one. And I really began to think, I am like crispy fried, because if I don't get up and do this thing, then who's going to do it? And so I really began to sort of step back. I was thinking about my health. I was thinking about my blood pressure. I was thinking about my stress level. So I was able to take a step back. And luckily, my fantastic colleagues at the Center for Constitutional Rights, even during this 3-month sabbatical, have been able to step in for that role, and things have been running smoothly. So I'm going to go back in 2 weeks, like super energized, and also a heck of a lot more clear about what my role is going to be and what we're going to do. So it's a mashup, but I would say the end of the thing is, like, to ask you this question, it's the hardest question to ask a lawyer. What brings you joy? I want you to think about it. What brings you joy? Not contentment, joy. And what that thing is, that's the thing that you lean into throughout your entire career.